The autumn of 1810 had been the season of Lady Rosalind Thorne's most public devastation. At 19 years of age, the only daughter of Sir Edmund Thorne, she had entered London society with all the bright hope of youth. Her father's estate in Hertfordshire was comfortable but modest, her dowry respectable but unremarkable. She possessed what her governess had called a dangerous beauty, auburn hair that blazed like fire in candlelight, eyes the color of spring leaves, and a spirit that refused to be dimmed by propriety. She had not anticipated capturing the attention of Julian Vane, second son of the Earl of Ashbourne, and one of the most ambitious gentlemen climbing the social ladder of Mayfair. Welcome, my beautiful family, to today's story. I'm so grateful you're here with me. If you're new to our community or you've been here from the beginning, I want you to know how much your presence means. We're building something special together, a space where stories of resilience, love, and finding worth in a world that often overlooks us can flourish. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I truly need your support to make that happen. If this story touches your heart, if these characters speak to someone within you, please hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not broken, just beautifully real. Every single subscriber helps us grow this family. And together we're proving that there's an audience for stories about people who bloom in darkness, who refuse to be invisible, who find love not despite their scars, but because of their authentic courage. Your support means everything. Let's build this community together. Now let's get into the story. Yet he pursued her with calculated intensity that made the gossips whisper from Hyde Park to Almack's. He had monopolized her dance card, the Winterbourne Ball, had sent hothouse roses to Thornhouse weekly, had engaged her in conversations about reform and politics that made her believe he valued her mind as much as her face. He had made her believe, foolish girl that she was, that ambition and love could coexist in one man's heart. "You have fire, Lady Rosalind," he had told her one afternoon in her father's library, his hazel eyes warm with what she mistook for sincerity. "These pale, simpering girls bore me to distraction. You speak your mind. You have convictions. You are extraordinary." She had allowed herself to dream, to imagine a future as Mrs. Julian Vane, not for his connections, but because she had genuinely believed he saw her, truly saw her, when the rest of society only saw a pretty face without political influence. Then Lady Constance Pemberton had returned from her grand tour, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Millbrook. Constance brought with her a dowry of £80,000, her father's seat in the House of Lords, and the kind of political power that Julian's career-hungry heart craved more than oxygen. She was beautiful in the way society preferred, golden-haired, delicate-featured, with a calculated charm of someone trained from birth to command ballrooms. Rosalind had watched Julian's devotion evaporate like morning mist. Within days, he was dancing attendance on Lady Constance. Within a fortnight, he was calling on the Pembertons daily. And then at the Ashford Ball, one of the most crowded events of the little season, Julian had approached Rosalind as she stood near the terrace doors, still wearing the emerald betrothal ring he had given her only 3 weeks prior. "Lady Rosalind," he had said, his voice pitched at exactly the volume needed to attract nearby listeners, "I must speak with you about a matter of some delicacy." She had known, had felt it in the pitying glances from the other young ladies, in the way conversation stuttered to silence when she entered a room, in the way Julian's eyes had stopped meeting hers the moment Lady Constance appeared. "I fear I must be brutally honest with you," Julian continued, and Rosalind noticed at least a dozen guests had drifted closer, pretending interest in the refreshments. "I hold you in great personal regard, but I have come to understand that my future requires certain strategic considerations. My political career depends upon connections your family simply cannot provide. The Earl requires that I marry where it will most benefit our standing. I trust you understand the position I'm in." The humiliation had cut deeper than any blade. Not merely the rejection that she might have borne privately, but the deliberate, public execution of her hopes. The way he had announced to all of Mayfair that she was inadequate, that her father's lack of parliamentary influence and her family's mere respectability made her unworthy of his continued attention. He had turned their engagement into a cautionary tale, her into an object lesson about the dangers of reaching above one's station. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Vane," she had said, her voice leveled despite the fire of mortification burning through her chest. She had pulled his ring from her finger and placed it deliberately in his palm. "I thank you for clarifying your priorities so thoroughly. It saves us both considerable time." She had maintained her composure through the remainder of the evening, had even smiled through 2 more dances, though she could not have named her partners at gunpoint. But when she returned to Thorne House that night, she had torn the emerald gown from her body, thrown Julian's letters into the fire, and wept tears of rage rather than sorrow. Within 6 weeks, Julian Vane's betrothal to Lady Constance Pemberton was announced in the Morning Post. That had been 2 years ago. 2 years during which Rosalind Thorne had not merely recovered, she had transformed. She had returned to Hertfordshire and spent those months reading everything in her father's library on estate management, political philosophy, and the subtle art of social warfare. She had studied the women who wielded power in the ton not through beauty alone, but through intelligence, strategy, and the kind of spine that made lesser people uncomfortable. When she returned to London for the season of 1812, Rosalind approached society not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. She wore gowns in shades of warrior green and deep crimson. She conversed with purpose, no longer seeking approval, but commanding respect. She danced when it suited her goals, and declined when it did not. She had received several offers: a widowed viscount seeking a mother for his children, a baron with more land than charm, a colonel with heroic credentials and modest prospects. She had declined them all with practiced grace. If she must marry for practical reasons rather than the love she no longer believed in, and her mother reminded her frequently that at 21 she was perilously close to being labeled a spinster, then she would ensure the match provided not just security, but armor, protection, power. She had not expected a proposal from Arthur St. Clair, the Duke of Ironwood. The Duke was a legend in English society, though not the romantic sort that inspired sighs from debutantes. At 34, he had held his title for 16 years, since his father's untimely death when Arthur was merely 18. He had inherited a dukedom teetering on scandal and transformed it into a fortress of wealth, influence, and fear. He was known for his brilliance, his ruthlessness in business, and his absolute intolerance for weakness or dishonesty. He attended society functions, as duty demanded, but remained separate, a dark star around which lesser planets orbited nervously. His black hair, piercing gray eyes, and tall, commanding presence made him undeniably attractive, but his reputation for cold calculation ensured that most young ladies found him terrifying rather than appealing. They called him the Iron Duke in the shadow of Mayfair. Some said he could ruin a man's fortune with a single word. Others claimed he had never smiled in public. Rosalind had encountered him only twice before he called upon her father. The first occasion had been at a political salon hosted by Lord Castlereagh, where Rosalind had accompanied her parents. The Duke had been deep in discussion with several MPs about agricultural reform when Rosalind, unable to contain herself, had interjected with an observation about tenant rights and crop management that she had learned from her father's steward. The conversation had frozen. Every man had turned to stare at her, some with disapproval at her audacity, others with surprise. The Duke had studied her with those unsettling gray eyes for a long moment before speaking. "A perceptive point, Lady Rosalind," he had said, his voice deep and measured. "Your father is fortunate to have a daughter who concerns herself with substance rather than gossip." The second meeting had occurred at Vauxhall Gardens just a week ago. Rosalind had been seeking escape from Lady Morrison's tedious speculation about which gentleman might propose this season, when she found herself in a quieter grove, standing before sculptured Diana the Huntress. The Duke had materialized from the shadows, as though he belonged to them. "Lady Rosalind," he had said without preamble or pleasantries, "I find myself in need of directness, and I believe you appreciate the quality as much as I do." "Your Grace," she had replied, curious but unafraid. One did not survive 2 years of rebuilding oneself by being timid. "I require a wife," he had stated as matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Not a decorative one, not a simpering one. I need a duchess capable of managing vast estates, commanding social situations, and matching my expectations for her competence and discretion. I need someone who will not bore me with trivialities or harbor romantic delusions about our arrangement." Rosalind had blinked, temporarily stunned by his bluntness. "I have observed you these past months," the Duke continued. "You possess intelligence, resilience, and dignity. You do not flinch at difficult conversations. You do not perform for approval. I believe you would make a suitable Duchess of Ironwood. You are proposing marriage, Your Grace?" Rosalind had asked, her mind racing to catch up with this extraordinary conversation. "I am proposing a strategic alliance that would benefit us both considerably," he had corrected. "I do not offer poetry or declarations of affection. I cannot promise love. But I offer honesty, protection, and a partnership built on mutual respect and clear expectations. My position would shield you from society's cruelty. Your capabilities will provide me with the formidable Duchess I require." He had paused, his gray eyes assessing her with unnerving precision. "I am aware of your history with Julian Vane. I mention this only to assure you. I do not break my word. I do not discard people for political convenience. Whatever else our marriage might be, Lady Rosalind, it would be honorable." That simple statement, delivered without dramatics or false sentiment, had struck deeper than any romantic declaration could have. Rosalind had spent 2 sleepless nights weighing the Duke's proposal. She had made columns of advantages and disadvantages, had consulted her mother, who nearly collapsed with excitement at the prospect of her daughter becoming a duchess, and had engaged in a frank conversation with her father in his study. "He is not offering love, Papa," she had said quietly. "He is offering a fortress." Her father, a gentleman who genuinely valued his daughter's happiness, had considered carefully. "That is true, Rosalind, but I will tell you what I know of the Duke of Ironwood. He keeps his promises. He protects what is his with absolute commitment. He does not gamble, does not keep mistresses, does not humiliate his dependents. He is feared, yes, but he is also just." He had taken her hand. "You will not have romance, my dear, but you will have something perhaps more valuable. You will have power, and you will never be vulnerable again." Her mother had been characteristically effusive. The Duchess of Ironwood. "Rosalind, you would be one of the highest-ranking women in all of England. You would have jewels, estates, influence, and such a handsome man, even if he is rather intimidating." In the end, Rosalind had made her decision based on one crystalline realization. Julian Vane had taught her that pretty words and passionate declarations were worth less than nothing. If she must marry, and at 1 in 20 with modest dowry, her options would only narrow. Then she would choose a marriage built on honesty rather than lies wrapped in poetry. She had sent word to the Duke that she would accept his proposal when he had called upon her father. The negotiations had been efficient and businesslike. The Duke's settlement was extraordinarily generous, far more than necessary, and included provisions ensuring Rosalind would have independent financial security regardless of circumstances. He promised her own household authority, her own carriage and staff, and freedom to pursue charitable works and intellectual interests within the bounds of propriety. "When would you prefer the wedding to take place, Lady Rosalind?" The Duke had asked her directly once the contracts were signed. "I leave the decision to you, Your Grace," she had replied. "Arthur," he had corrected, his expression unreadable. "If we are to be married, we might as well use Christian names in private. I propose we marry by special license within the week. A private ceremony. I see no purpose in subjecting either of us to months of speculation and social theater." Rosalind had agreed with relief, grateful to avoid the prolonged scrutiny that would inevitably accompany such an unexpected match. They married 4 days later in the chapel at Ironwood House, with only their immediate families present. The Duke, Arthur, had been punctual, formally dressed and precisely polite. He had spoken his vows in a clear, unwavering voice that somehow made even the traditional words sound like a binding contract rather than romantic promise. When he had placed a heavy platinum wedding band on her finger, set with a massive emerald that seemed to capture all the fire of her hair, Rosalind had realized she was no longer just Lady Rosalind Thorne. She was the Duchess of Ironwood, and Julian Vane had no idea what was coming for him. The morning after the Ashford ball, Rosalind had left London without ceremony or explanation. She had endured her mother's tearful protests and ignored the flood of calling cards from ladies eager to dissect her humiliation over tea. She wanted none of their pity, none of their carefully rehearsed condolences that barely masked their satisfaction at witnessing someone else's downfall. Thorne Manor in Hertfordshire became her fortress and her forge. The estate was modest by aristocratic standards, a comfortable manor house, surrounded by tenant farms and woodland that held more peace than any London ballroom ever would. Here, away from the suffocating scrutiny of Mayfair, Rosalind began the deliberate work of transformation. She burned every letter Julian had written her, watched the pages curl and blacken in the library fireplace until his promises were nothing but ash. She packed away the pastel muslins and soft pinks that had been her wardrobe as a naive debutante. If society had declared her damage diminished less than, then she would embrace it and weaponize it. She would never again be the girl who believed in pretty words. The first 6 months, she barely left the estate. She rode to the countryside at dawn, pushing her mare to speeds that made the grooms nervous. She read voraciously, not novels of romance, but her father's books on political philosophy, agricultural economics, estate management. She spent hours with Mr. Pemberton, her father's steward, learning how to read account books, negotiate with tenants, manage investments. If she was to survive in a world that valued power over sentiment, then she would acquire power in every form available to her. By the second year, Rosalind had emerged from her self-imposed exile transformed. She commissioned an entirely new wardrobe from London's finest modiste, but her instructions were precise and uncompromising. No more pale pastels. No more virginal whites. She wanted emerald silk that gleamed like armor, deep forest green velvet that commanded attention, gowns in shades of jade and malachite that made her auburn hair look like living flame. Every dress was cut to perfection, elegant but never demure, sophisticated but never apologetic. She practiced her new persona in the looking glass like an actress preparing for the stage. Gone was the bright, eager smile that had once lit her face. In its place, she cultivated a cool, assessing gaze that made people uncomfortable when held too long. She learned to arch one eyebrow in withering skepticism. She perfected a tone of voice that could deliver devastating observations wrapped in perfect politeness. Her father watched this metamorphosis with mixed feelings. "You've grown harder, my dear," he said one evening as they sat in the library. "No, Papa," Rosalind had corrected, looking up from a treatise on parliamentary procedure. "I've simply grown up. The world taught me what it values. I'm merely adapting to survive in it." By the spring of 1812, when her mother began pressing for a return to London, Rosalind was ready, not ready to seek another husband. She had no illusions left about romantic attachment, but ready to reclaim her place in society on her own terms. She would not slink back to town like a wounded creature seeking shelter. She would return as something far more dangerous, a woman who had learned exactly what the game was and how ruthlessly it must be played. The morning of their departure for London, Rosalind stood before her wardrobe of emerald battle dress and selected a gown the color of forest at midnight. The silk whispered promises of authority as she moved. She fastened emerald earrings at her ears, not Julian's ring, which she had returned, but stones she had purchased with her own money. Everything she wore now, she owned completely. Her lady's maid, Martha, who had known her since childhood, watched with knowing eyes. "You look like a queen going to war, my lady." Rosalind smiled then, but it was not the smile of the girl who had left London 2 years ago. This smile had edges. "Not a queen, Martha. Queens are born to their power. I had to earn mine the hard way." As the Thorne carriage rolled toward London, Rosalind gazed out at the countryside, giving way to the smoke and bustle of the city. Somewhere in Mayfair, Julian Vane was living his life with Lady Constance, secure in his political ambitions, probably never thinking twice about the girl he had publicly discarded at the Ashford ball. He would think of her soon enough. The Ton would remember Lady Rosalind Thorne, but not as the humiliated debutante whose engagement had been terminated in front of half of society. They would remember her as something else entirely. She just didn't know yet how complete that transformation would be, or that the Duke of Ironwood was already watching. Rosalind first heard the whispers about the Duke of Ironwood before she ever saw him. They circulated through London drawing rooms like a dark current beneath polite conversation, spoken in lowered voices with a mixture of fear and fascination. He ruined Lord Petersham in a single afternoon, Lady Weatherby had murmured at a musicale, her fan fluttering nervously. Called in every debt, bought up every note. Petersham had to flee to the continent. I heard he turned down the Prince Regent's request for a loan, another lady added. Simply said no. Can you imagine? My husband says he has eyes like winter itself. Mrs. Dalton contributed with a delicate shiver. That he can calculate a man's worth in seconds and finds most wanting. Rosalind had listened to these accounts with detached interest. The ton loved its legends and its villains. She assumed the Duke of Ironwood was merely another wealthy peer whose success had bred resentment among lesser men. London society had a particular talent for making monsters out of anyone who refused to play by their arbitrary rules. Then she met him at Lord Castlereagh's political salon and understood that every whispered rumor had been inadequate to capture the reality of Arthur St. Clair. He stood apart from the cluster of MPs and peers debating agriculture reform, a dark figure in impeccably tailored black who seemed to occupy space differently than other men, taller than most, with shoulders that suggested physical power beneath the civilized veneer of evening dress. His hair was black as midnight, swept back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines. But it was his eyes that arrested attention, gray as storm clouds, penetrating and analytical, missing nothing. Rosalind had been standing with her father when the Duke's gaze swept across the room and landed on her. For a moment that felt suspended outside time, those gray eyes assessed her with the same cool precision one might use to evaluate a piece of property. She should have looked away. Every rule of propriety demanded it. Instead, she met his stare directly, lifting her chin in silent challenge. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite interest, but perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit who refused to be cowed. The conversation had turned to tenant rights and crop rotation when Rosalind, unable to contain herself, interjected with an observation about yield improvements her father's steward had implemented. The room fell silent. Every man turned to stare at her, with varying degrees of disapproval and surprise. The Duke studied her for a long moment that made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something sharper. A perceptive point, Lady Rosalind, he said finally, his voice deep and measured, each word precisely placed. Your father is fortunate to have a daughter who concerns herself with substance rather than gossip. It was not a compliment. Exactly. More an acknowledgement. A statement of fact delivered without embellishment or false flattery. Somehow, that made it more valuable than any pretty phrase Julian had ever offered. Later that evening, Rosalind had asked her father about the Duke. Sir Edmund had chosen his words carefully. Arthur St. Clair is the most dangerous man in England, he said quietly. Not because he's cruel, but because he's utterly without sentiment. He sees the world as a series of calculations and acts accordingly. He's never been known to break his word, but he's equally never been known to show mercy to those who cross him. He sounds rather practical, Rosalind had observed. Her father had given her a sharp look. Perhaps, but he's also terribly alone. Power without warmth makes for a cold existence. My dear. Rosalind had dismissed the concern. She understood loneliness, had chosen it. In fact, over the alternative of making herself vulnerable again. If the Duke of Ironwood had built walls around himself, she could hardly fault him for it. She had been constructing her own fortress for 2 years. Their second encounter came at the theater a month later. A chance arrangement of boxes had placed the Thorns adjacent to the Duke's private box. During the interval, he had appeared at the partition between them, materializing with a quiet precision that seemed characteristic of him. Lady Rosalind, he had said, without preamble, your opinion on the performance? Not a pleasantry about the weather, not empty flattery. A direct question that assumed she had thoughts worth hearing. She had offered critique of the lead actress's interpretation of the role, which had sparked an unexpectedly engaging discussion about theatrical convention and social satire. The Duke listened when she spoke. Actually listened, his gray eyes focused entirely on her, as though her words carried weight and consequence. He disagreed with her on several points, but his disagreement was intellectual rather than dismissive, challenging her reasoning without condescending to her. When the interval ended and they returned to their respective boxes, Rosalind realized she had just experienced something rare, a conversation with a man who treated her mind as valuable. Her mother had been nearly vibrating with excitement. The Duke of Ironwood spoke with you for nearly 15 minutes. Rosalind, do you realize how extraordinary that is? He barely speaks to anyone. But Rosalind had been thinking about something else entirely, about the way the Duke's walls reminded her of her own, about how two people who had armored themselves against the world might recognize each other across a crowded theater, about whether he had felt the same strange resonance she had, not attraction precisely, but recognition. She would encounter him once more before everything changed, once more before he would make his extraordinary proposal, and offer the one thing she'd spent 2 years learning to value above all else: power wrapped in an unbreakable promise. The third encounter happened at Lady Pemberton's garden party, amid the carefully manicured roses and the artificial laughter of the ton. Rosalind had been seeking refuge from Mrs. Dalton's pointed questions about her matrimonial prospects when she found herself in a secluded corner of the garden, standing before an ancient oak that had likely witnessed a century of society's performances. The Duke of Ironwood emerged from the shadow of the tree as though he had been waiting for her. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, his gray eyes seemed almost silver. "Lady Rosalind," he said without preamble or pleasantries, "I find myself in need of directness, and I believe you appreciate the quality as much as I do." "Your Grace," she replied, her pulse quickening despite her determination to remain unaffected. One did not survive 2 years of rebuilding oneself by being easily unsettled, yet something about his presence demanded alertness. "I require a wife," he stated, as matter-of-factly as if discussing a business acquisition. "Not a decorative one. Not a simpering one who will require constant reassurance and romantic gestures. I have neither the time nor the inclination to provide. I need a duchess capable of managing vast estates, commanding social situations, and matching my expectations for her competence and absolute discretion." Rosalind felt her breath catch, but she kept her expression neutral. "That is quite a list of requirements, Your Grace." "I am not finished," he continued, his gaze never wavering from hers. "I need someone who will not bore me with trivialities or harbor romantic delusions about our arrangement. Someone intelligent enough to engage in substantive conversation and practical enough to understand that marriage is fundamentally a contract between two parties with aligned interests." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the evidence of years spent calculating and strategizing. "I have observed you these past months, Lady Rosalind. You possess intelligence that most men find threatening. You have resilience that comes only from having been broken and choosing to rebuild yourself stronger. You have dignity that does not depend on others' approval. You do not perform for society's benefit, and you do not flinch at difficult truths." "You have been observing me?" Rosalind asked, uncertain whether to be flattered or unsettled. "I observe everyone," he replied with brutal honesty. "But you are the only woman in London who looks at me and does not either simper with feigned attraction or recoil in poorly disguised fear. You see me clearly, and you are not impressed by my title or intimidated by my reputation. That quality is exceptionally rare and exceptionally valuable. You are proposing marriage, Your Grace?" Rosalind heard herself ask, her mind racing to process this extraordinary conversation. "I am proposing a strategic alliance that would benefit us both considerably," he corrected. "I do not offer poetry or declarations of affection. I cannot promise love. I am uncertain I am capable of it, and I will not lie to you about my limitations. But I can offer you honesty, protection, and a partnership built on mutual respect and clearly defined expectations." He paused, his expression unreadable. "My position would shield you from society's cruelty. My wealth would ensure you never want for security. My name would transform you from an object of pity into one of the most powerful women in England. Your intelligence would provide me with a duchess capable of managing Ironwood's complex affairs. Your strength would give me a partner rather than a dependent. Your dignity would reflect well on my house." Rosalind found herself mesmerized by his directness. Every other man who had shown interest in her had wrapped their intentions in layers of false sentiment. Julian had spoken of her mind and her spirit while calculating her father's political value. The Duke was offering something far more honest, a transaction where both parties understood exactly what they were trading. "I am aware of your history with Julian Vane," the Duke said, and Rosalind stiffened. "I mention this only to assure you, I do not break my word. I do not discard people when they cease to be politically convenient. I do not humiliate those under my protection. Whatever else our marriage might be, Lady Rosalind, it would be honorable. You would be my Duchess, and I protect what is mine with absolute commitment." The last statement carried a weight that made something in Rosalind's chest tighten. Not romantic love, but something perhaps more valuable. The promise of unwavering loyalty from a man who clearly understood the cost of betrayal. "You are the only one who doesn't flinch at my shadow," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "You stand in it as though darkness does not frighten you, because you have learned to carry your own darkness, I suspect." Rosalind met his gray eyes and saw in him a reflection of her own transformation. Two people who had armored themselves against vulnerability, who had chosen power over sentiment, who understood that survival sometimes required becoming harder than the world that tried to break you. "I need time to consider your proposal, Your Grace," she said finally. "Arthur," he corrected. "And yes, you should take time. This is not a decision to be made hastily." He reached into his coat and withdrew a card. "Send word to this address when you have decided. I shall call upon your father 3 days hence. If you wish to decline, send word before then." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Lady Rosalind. I do not need a wife for love. I need a duchess who can command a room, manage an empire, and stand beside me as an equal. You are the only woman in England who meets those requirements. Consider that when you make your decision." Then he was gone, leaving Rosalind standing in the shadow of the oak tree, holding his card and contemplating the most extraordinary proposal she could have imagined. The chapel at Ironwood House was nothing like the grand cathedral wedding Rosalind had once imagined as a naive girl. It was a small, private sanctuary built in the 16th century, with stone walls that held centuries of whispered prayers and solemn vows. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting patterns of emerald and sapphire across the ancient flagstones. Rosalind had made her decision after 2 sleepless nights of contemplation, after conversations with her father that lasted until dawn, after weighing every advantage against every risk. She had sent word to Arthur's address with a single line, "I accept your terms." His response had been equally concise. "The ceremony will take place in 4 days. I shall make the arrangements." True to his word, everything had been handled with quiet efficiency. The special license obtained through channels only a duke could access. The limited guest list, her parents, his younger sister Lady Caroline, and the family solicitor to witness the contracts. No society spectacle, no months of preparation and gossip, just a swift, decisive union that spoke to the practical nature of their arrangement. Now, standing in the anteroom of the chapel in a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to capture all the fire of her hair, Rosalind felt an unexpected tremor of nerves. Not fear, precisely, but awareness that she was about to irrevocably alter the course of her life, that she was binding herself to a man she barely knew, whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his reputation for keeping his word. Her father squeezed her hand gently. "Are you certain, my dear?" "I am certain that this is the choice that makes sense," Rosalind replied, which was not quite the same thing but was honest enough. "Then let us not keep the Duke waiting," her father said with a small, sad smile. "He strikes me as a man who values punctuality." The chapel doors opened, and Rosalind stepped into the sacred space on her father's arm. Arthur stood before the altar in formal black, his tall figure a dark silhouette against the colored light streaming through the windows. As she approached, his gray eyes found hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker in their depths, something she could not quite name. He did not smile. That would have been dishonest, given the nature of their arrangement. But he watched her progress down the short aisle with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When she reached his side, he extended his hand, and she placed hers in it. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly steady. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity. The elderly priest spoke the ancient words about love and devotion, duty and honor, though Rosalind suspected he knew this was no conventional love match. Arthur's responses were delivered in that deep, measured voice that never wavered. Clear, certain, binding. When it came time for her vows, Rosalind spoke with equal clarity. She would not pretend trembling emotion she did not feel, but she would honor the contract they had made. I, Rosalind and Thorne, take thee, Arthur Leopold St. Clair, to be my wedded husband, to have and hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death us do part. The word obey caught in her throat slightly, but Arthur's eyes narrowed with what might have been amusement. They both knew she would not obey blindly. That was not what he had chosen her for. When Arthur slipped the heavy platinum band onto her finger, set with an enormous emerald that caught the chapel light and blazed like green fire, Rosalind gasped softly. It was not the ring of a business transaction. It was a statement, a crown, a weapon forged in precious metal and stone. I had it made for you, Arthur said quietly, just for her ears. Emerald for the armor you wear. Platinum because anything less substantial would be insufficient. It was perhaps the closest thing to a romantic gesture he had ever made, though delivered with his characteristic directness. Rosalind looked up at him, surprised, and found him watching her face with an expression she had never seen before. Not cold calculation, not professional assessment. Something warmer, something almost like wonder. You may kiss the bride, the priest intoned. Arthur hesitated for the briefest moment, and Rosalind realized with sudden clarity that this would be their first kiss, that despite all their frank discussions and negotiations, they had never touched beyond the formal clasp of hands. The intimacy of it, even in this contractual context, suddenly felt significant. He lowered his head, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. She did not. When his lips met hers, the kiss was not passionate or desperate. It was measured, deliberate, and somehow more affecting for its restraint. A promise sealed, a contract ratified, a partnership begun. When they separated, Rosalind saw a color high on Arthur's cheekbones, the only evidence that he was not entirely unaffected. His gray eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw in them something she had not expected to find. Genuine admiration, not for her beauty or her social graces, but for her, the steel-spined woman who had agreed to stand beside him in his fortress of power. Your Grace, he said quietly, the formal address now transformed into her new title. My Duchess. And in that moment, Rosalind understood that while their marriage might have begun as a contract, it had the potential to become something far more dangerous. A genuine partnership between two people who recognized in each other the same fierce determination to survive and thrive in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. As they turned to face their small gathering of witnesses, Arthur kept her hand in his grip firm and possessive. Lady Caroline St. Clair was weeping openly, whether from joy or grief Rosalind could not tell. Her parents looked relieved and anxious in equal measure. The solicitor was already preparing the documents that would make everything legally binding. But Rosalind was thinking about the way Arthur had looked at her when she reached the altar, the way his hand had trembled almost imperceptibly as he placed the ring on her finger, the way his kiss had lingered just a fraction longer than strictly necessary. Perhaps their marriage was a contract, but contracts, she was learning, could contain unexpected clauses. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days after the ceremony, placed with deliberate prominence, where every member of the ton would see it over their breakfast chocolate. His Grace the Duke of Ironwood is pleased to announce his marriage to Lady Rosalind Thorne, daughter of Sir Edmund Thorne of Hertfordshire. The ceremony took place privately at Ironwood House. By noon, every drawing room in Mayfair was ablaze with speculation. By evening, the gossip had reached fever pitch. Rosalind learned of the reaction from Lady Caroline, Arthur's sister, who had taken upon herself to serve as an interpreter of society's dramatics. They're saying it's impossible, Caroline reported over tea in the grand drawing room of Ironwood House, her eyes dancing with barely suppressed glee, that Arthur would never marry, let alone marry so suddenly. Lady Pemberton fainted. Actually fainted. Mrs. Dalton is claiming she knew all along, which is a magnificent lie, and the betting books at White's have been in absolute chaos. Rosalind sipped her tea, affecting a calm she did not entirely feel. What are they wagering on? How long the marriage will last, Caroline said bluntly. Whether it's a marriage in name only, whether you trapped him somehow, or whether he's using you for some mysterious political purpose. The tongue cannot conceive that my brother simply chose you because you're brilliant and refused to be intimidated by him. That evening, Rosalind made her first public appearance as the Duchess of Ironwood at Lady Ashford's ball. Arthur had asked if she preferred to wait, to ease into her new role gradually, but Rosalind had declined. She had not spent 2 years transforming herself, only to hide now that she had achieved a position of power. She descended from the Ironwood carriage in a gown of deepest emerald velvet, the massive emerald ring blazing on her finger, with Arthur's ducal crest embroidered in silver thread at her hem. Arthur emerged behind her, impossibly commanding in black evening dress, and offered his arm with deliberate formality. "They're watching," he murmured as they ascended the steps. "Every eye in London is on us tonight." "Good," Rosalind replied. "Let them watch." The ballroom fell silent as they were announced. His Grace the Duke of Ironwood, and Her Grace the Duchess of Ironwood. The title still felt strange on her tongue, but Rosalind held her head high as they entered. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, hear the whispers that started the moment they passed. Arthur guided her through the crowd with quiet authority, his hand at the small of her back both possessive and protective. People parted before them like water before a ship's bow. Some offered congratulations that rang hollow with curiosity. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the famously aloof Duke with the concept of matrimony. Then Rosalind saw him. Julian Vane stood near the refreshment table with Lady Constance on his arm, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and something darker. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Rosalind watched recognition dawn on his face, followed swiftly by humiliation. She had not merely survived his rejection. She had transcended it entirely. She was now so far above him in rank and consequence that he would be required to bow to her. The jilted girl he had publicly discarded was now a duchess, while he remained merely the second son of an earl, scrambling for political relevance through his wife's connections. Julian's face flushed red, then drained to white. Lady Constance whispered something urgent in his ear, her own expression tight with displeasure. They had heard the news, obviously, but seeing Rosalind in the flesh, radiant in emerald silk, with the Duke of Ironwood's hand at her back and his ring on her finger, made a reality inescapable. Arthur followed her gaze and his eyes narrowed. "That is Julian Vane," he said. "Not a question, but a statement." "Yes," Rosalind replied quietly. "He looks ill," Arthur observed with cold satisfaction. "I imagine seeing you as my Duchess has disrupted his digestion considerably." Throughout the evening, Rosalind felt Julian's stare following her. When they passed near enough for conversation, he and Lady Constance were required to bow and curtsy to the Duke and Duchess of Ironwood. The humiliation in Julian's eyes was gratifying, but Rosalind kept her expression graciously neutral. She would not give him the satisfaction of knowing she had noticed. But Julian, she would learn later from Caroline's network of gossips, had not accepted his diminishment gracefully. At White's that very night, deep in his cups, he had held forth to anyone who would listen. "It's a sham, obviously," he had declared, his words slurring slightly. "The iced Duke and the unwanted Thorn? He's probably paying off her father's debts or using her for some political scheme. There's no genuine attachment there. Mark my words. Within 6 months she'll be tucked away in the country, while he carries on as before. She always was too ambitious for her own good, grasping at titles above her station." The words, reported to Rosalind by a gleefully scandalized Lady Caroline, stung more than she wanted to admit, not because she cared for Julian's opinion, but because there was a kernel of truth in them. Her marriage was a contract. Arthur had been explicit about that, but Julian had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that because the marriage was practical rather than romantic, it was therefore vulnerable. He had failed to understand that Arthur St. Clair did not make contracts he could not honor, and that attacking the Duchess of Ironwood was tantamount to attacking the Duke himself. When Arthur learned of Julian's public commentary, and he learned of everything that concerned his interests, his response was delivered in a voice of absolute ice. "Mr. Vane has made an error in judgment," he said over breakfast the next morning, his gray eyes flat and cold. "He will learn the cost of that error soon enough." Rosalind looked at her husband across the table and saw in his expression something that made her pulse quicken. Not anger, Precisely. But the cold, calculated fury of a man whose property had been insulted. She was his duchess now, and Arthur protected what was his with absolute ruthlessness. Julian Vane had just made a very dangerous enemy. He simply didn't know it yet. The Prince Regent's annual masquerade was the most anticipated event of the London season, a glittering spectacle of excess and intrigue, where identities were hidden behind elaborate masks and inhibitions loosened behind the veil of anonymity. The ballroom at Carlton House blazed with thousands of candles, their light reflecting off mirrors and gilt until the entire space seemed to shimmer like something from a fever dream. Rosalind had chosen her costume with deliberate intent. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to shift between green and black in the candlelight, with a bodice embroidered in silver thread that suggested dragon scales. Her mask was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Emerald feathers and silver filigree that covered the upper half of her face, while leaving her distinctive auburn hair visible. She looked like some mythical creature, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Arthur had approved of the costume with one of his rare, almost smiles. "You look like a queen who might order executions before breakfast," he had observed. "It suits you." He had chosen to attend separately, arriving an hour after her, a strategic decision that would serve their purposes well. His own mask was simple black leather that somehow made him appear even more intimidating, all sharp angles and shadow. Rosalind had been circulating through the ballroom, dancing twice and engaging in careful conversation with several influential ladies, when she felt the need for air. The press of bodies and the cloying scent of perfume and candle wax had grown oppressive. She slipped through the French doors onto one of Carlton House's secluded balconies, grateful for the cool night air against her heated skin. She had been standing there for perhaps 5 minutes, watching the London night and contemplating the strange turn her life had taken, when she heard footsteps behind her. Well, if it isn't the unwanted Thorn. Rosalind's spine stiffened. She knew that voice, had heard it whisper promises and then pronouncement of rejection. She turned slowly to find Julian Vane standing in the balcony doorway, his mask pushed up onto his forehead and a glass of champagne dangling carelessly from his fingers. His eyes were bright with drink and malice. "Mr. Vane," she said coolly, keeping her voice level despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "No need for formality, Rosalind," he said, moving closer with the false confidence of someone who consumed too much champagne. "We're old friends, are we not? Or should I say, old almost somethings." He laughed at his own wit. Rosalind said nothing, simply watched him with the cool assessment she had perfected over 2 years. But Julian, emboldened by alcohol and perceived anonymity of the masquerade, continued his approach. "I've been hearing the most amusing rumors about you," he said, leaning against the balcony railing with studied casualness. "Apparently you've managed to trap some poor fool into marriage, though I confess I find it hard to believe. Last I heard, you were still quite husbandless and growing more so by the day." "Your information is outdated," Rosalind replied, her voice like ice. "Oh, I'm sure it is," Julian said with mock sympathy. 2 years is a long time to remain on the shelf, isn't it? Tell me, did you have to settle for some doddering country squire? Or perhaps a widower desperate for a mother to his brats? He took a long sip of champagne. "I do hope you didn't hold out for a love match. We both know how that particular delusion ended for you." Rosalind felt anger rising in her chest, hot and dangerous, but she kept her expression neutral. "You seem remarkably interested in my circumstances for a married man. Merely curious about the fate of old acquaintances," Julian said with a shrug. "One can't help but wonder what becomes of the girls who reach for stars and find only empty air. You were always too ambitious, Rosalind, too convinced of your own worth. I try to tell you, quietly, privately, that you lack the connections necessary for someone in my position, but you force my hand with your expectations. You ended our engagement in front of half of Mayfair," Rosalind said flatly. "Because you wouldn't accept reality," Julian shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You're the daughter of a baronet with no political influence and a modest dowry. You're beautiful enough, I'll grant you, but beauty fades and connections endure. Surely you understand that now? Surely 2 years of humiliation have taught you to know your place." He stepped closer, his breath reeking of champagne and spite. Tell me, Rosalind, did you ever manage to find a husband? Or are you still waiting for some foolish romantic to overlook your damaged reputation and your family's insignificance? Rosalind met his gaze directly, her green eyes cold behind her mask. I am married, Mr. Vane. Oh. Julian's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. How delightful. And who is the fortunate gentleman? Anyone I know? Or did you have to settle for someone outside our usual circles? You might say he travels in rather elevated circles, Rosalind replied, her voice dangerously soft. Julian laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone balcony. How mysterious. Well, I do hope he has a title at least. After all your grasping and scheming, it would be terribly disappointing if you ended up as plain Mrs. Somebody or other, though I suppose any husband is better than none, even at your advanced age. He raised a champagne glass in a mocking toast to the unwanted Thorn, who finally managed to ensnare some poor fool. May he discover what he's gotten himself into before it's too late. That, a deep voice said from the shadows behind Julian, is quite enough. Julian spun around, nearly dropping his champagne glass, as Arthur St. Clair stepped out of the darkness at the edge of the balcony. He had been there the entire time, Rosalind realized with a start, watching, listening, allowing Julian to condemn himself with every poisonous word. The Duke removed his mask slowly, deliberately, letting the candlelight from the ballroom illuminate his face. His gray eyes were colder than a winter storm, and his expression promised consequences that would be neither swift nor merciful. Your Grace, Julian stammered, his face draining of color. I did not realize. Clearly, Arthur said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You did not realize many things, Mr. Vane. Allow me to enlighten you. Arthur moved forward with the lethal grace of predator, closing in on wounded prey. Julian stumbled backward, his champagne glass slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble balcony. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, terrible silence. Your Grace, I apologize. I had no idea, Julian began, his voice trembling. No idea that you were speaking to my wife. Arthur's voice was soft, deadly, each word precisely enunciated. How curious, given that the announcement of our marriage appeared in every newspaper in London 3 weeks ago, given that we have attended for society events together, given that you yourself were required a bow to the Duchess of Ironwood at Lady Ashford's ball just last week. Julian's face had gone from white to gray. The mask? I didn't recognize. You didn't recognize the distinctive auburn hair that you once claimed to admire? Arthur took another step forward, and Julian pressed himself against the balcony railing as though he might fall backward into the garden below. Or perhaps you simply chose not to recognize her because you believed yourself safe behind the anonymity of a masquerade to deliver your petty cruelties. Rosalind stood frozen, watching her husband dismantle Julian Vane with the cold precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She had expected Arthur to defend her. That was part of their contract, after all. But this was something beyond mere defense. This was retribution. Let me clarify your situation, Mr. Vane, Arthur continued, his gray eyes never leaving Julian's face. You have just insulted the Duchess of Ironwood. My Duchess, my wife, the woman who stands under my protection and bears my name. Do you understand the magnitude of your error? Your Grace, I swear I meant no disrespect to you. Julian tried desperately. But you meant every disrespect to her. Arthur cut him off, his voice dropping to a tone that made even Rosalind shiver. You called her the unwanted Thorn. You mocked her for lacking connections. You implied she had trapped some fool into marriage. You questioned her worth based on her father's political standing and her dowry. You treated her as though she were nothing. Arthur moved closer still, until he towered over the cowering man. Allow me to correct your numerous misconceptions. Lady Rosalind, her Grace, the Duchess of Ironwood, is the most intelligent, resilient, and formidable woman in England. I chose her precisely because she possesses qualities that money cannot buy and titles cannot confer. She commands my respect, my protection, and my absolute loyalty, which means, Mr. Vane, that you have made an enemy of the wrong man. Julian's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish gasping on dry land. "I have been watching you, Mr. Vane," Arthur continued, his tone now conversational but no less terrifying. "Since you saw fit to spread rumors at White's about my marriage being a sham, I took an interest in your affairs. It took my investigators less than a week to compile a comprehensive accounting of your situation. Would you like to hear what they discovered?" Julian's silence was answer enough. "Your debts are considerable," Arthur stated flatly. "Gaming debts, primarily, though also some rather expensive mistresses. Your father, the Earl of Ashbourne, refuses to pay them any longer. Your wife's dowry, substantial though it was, has been nearly depleted by your attempts to maintain a lifestyle your actual income cannot support. You have mortgaged Vane Hall, your ancestral home, to the hilt." The color that had begun to return to Julian's face drained away again. "Or rather, you had mortgaged Vane Hall," Arthur corrected with cold satisfaction. "3 days ago, I purchased every one of your debts. Every gambling marker, every note, every mortgage. I now own, quite literally, everything you possess except the clothes on your back and whatever jewelry your wife has managed to keep out of the pawnbroker's hands." You cannot," Julian whispered. "I can and I have," Arthur said. "Vane Hall is mine. Your father's seat cannot protect you from debts you personally incurred, and I am calling in every penny effective immediately." Rosalind watched Julian's face crumble, watched the arrogance and malice drain away to leave only naked terror. This was the man who had humiliated her in front of all of Mayfair, who had made her an object of pity and gossip, who had just moments ago mocked her for being unwanted. Now he stood broken before the man she had married, realizing too late the cost of his cruelty. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Vane," Arthur continued relentlessly. "The first is that I demand immediate payment in full. Your properties will be seized, your possessions sold at auction, and you and your wife will be left destitute. I believe the current fashion is for bankrupt gentlemen to flee to the continent. How delightful that Lady Constance will finally get her grand tour, albeit under rather different circumstances than she imagined." Julian made a sound that might have been a sob. "Your second option," Arthur said, his voice softening by the barest degree, "is that you accept my terms. You will leave this ball immediately, without speaking to anyone. You will depart London by dawn and retire to the country. Not to Vane Hall, which is no longer yours, but to whatever modest property your wife's family can provide. You will not return to London for 5 years. You will not speak of my wife, my marriage, or my affairs to anyone. You will, in effect, disappear from society. In exchange, I will hold your debts without demanding immediate payment and allow you to maintain what remains of your dignity. And if I refuse both options?" Julian asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Then I will destroy you," Arthur said simply. "Not quickly, not mercifully. I will ensure that every door in England closes to you, that every opportunity evaporates, that your name becomes synonymous with failure and disgrace. I will make certain that your children, should you have any, carry the stain of your actions. I am a patient man, Mr. Vane, and my memory is exceptionally long." Julian looked at Rosalind then, his eyes pleading for mercy that she felt no inclination to grant. She held his gaze steadily, her expression as cold as her husband's voice. "Choose," Arthur commanded. "I will leave London," Julian whispered. "I accept your terms." "Wise," Arthur said. "Now get out of my sight. And Mr. Vane, if I hear that you have spoken my wife's name with anything less than utmost respect, I will reconsider my mercy. Do we understand each other?" Julian nodded mutely and fled, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed across the balcony, then faded into the music and laughter of the ballroom beyond. Arthur turned to Rosalind, his expression softening fractionally. "Are you well?" Rosalind found she was trembling, though not from fear. "You destroyed him." "I protected what is mine," Arthur corrected. "No one insults my wife. Not publicly, not privately, not ever." And in that moment, standing on the balcony where Julian Vane had attempted to humiliate her one final time, Rosalind realized that her marriage was no longer simply a contract. It was something far more powerful and far more dangerous. They left the masquerade shortly after Julian's departure, Arthur citing a headache that fooled no one who saw the cold satisfaction in his eyes. The carriage ride back to Ironwood House was silent, but not uncomfortably so. Rosalind sat across from her husband, watching the play of shadows across his face as the street lamps flickered past, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Arthur had not merely defended her. He had obliterated Julian Vane with a kind of comprehensive ruthlessness that most men only threatened but never executed. And he had done it, she realized, not because their contract required it, but because someone had dared to hurt what belonged to him. When they arrived home, Arthur handed his coat and gloves to the waiting footman and turned to Rosalind. "Would you join me in the library? I find myself disinclined to sleep just yet." It was not a command, she noted. It was a request, offered with the same careful courtesy he had shown her from the beginning. She nodded, suddenly grateful that this conversation would happen in private, away from servants and society's endless scrutiny. The library at Ironwood House was Arthur's sanctuary, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and furnished in dark leather and polished wood. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Arthur moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of deep red wine, then handed one to Rosalind. "I hope I did not overstep," he said, surprising her with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "When I heard him call you the unwanted thorn, I confess I saw red. My response was perhaps more comprehensive than strictly necessary." Rosalind took a sip of wine, letting the rich flavor ground her. "You bankrupted him. You took his ancestral home. You exiled him from London." "I did," Arthur agreed, his gray eyes watching her carefully. "And I would do it again without hesitation. Though I recognize that my actions may have complicated your position. You might prefer to handle Julian Vane differently, or not at all." "Handle him differently?" Rosalind felt something bubble up in her chest. Not anger, but something uncomfortably close to laughter. "Arthur, he stood on that balcony and stripped me of every dignity, every worth, reduced me to nothing more than damaged goods too foolish to know my place. And you made him understand exactly what he had lost when he discarded me, what he threw away." She set down her wine glass with trembling hands. "No one has ever defended me like that. My father loves me, but he couldn't protect me from Julian's public humiliation 2 years ago. My mother means well, but she counseled acceptance and silence. But you," her voice caught, "you went to war for me. You are my wife," Arthur said simply, as though that explained everything. "My Duchess. An insult to you is an insult to me, and I do not tolerate insults. It is merely practical." "Practical," Rosalind repeated, and this time she did laugh, though the sound was edged with something that might have been tears. "Arthur, you spent a fortune purchasing a man's debts for revenge. That is not practical. That is—" "What?" he asked, moving closer, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Personal," Rosalind finished quietly. "That was personal." Arthur was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant ticking of the mantel clock. Then he set down his own glass and reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "Perhaps it was," he admitted, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "When I proposed marriage, I told you I could not promise love. I told you this would be a practical arrangement based on mutual benefit and respect. I believed those words when I spoke them. And now," Rosalind whispered, afraid to break whatever spell was settling over them in the firelit quiet. "Now I find myself questioning my own certainty," Arthur said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I married you because you were intelligent, capable, and unafraid of me, because you could command a room and manage an estate, and hold your own in any conversation, because you understood that power matters in this world, and you were willing to wield it." He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. "But somewhere between the chapel and tonight, between watching you navigate society with such grace and listening to that fool insult you on that balcony, I realized something. I do not simply respect you, Rosalind. He seemed to struggle with the words, as though they were foreign to his tongue. "I care for you, genuinely, not as a duchess or a business partner, but as you." Rosalind felt her breath catch. This was Arthur St. Clair, the man who approached everything with cold calculation, who had built walls around himself so high that most people believed he had no heart at all. And he was standing before her, his hand holding hers, offer her something infinitely more valuable than his title or his wealth, his carefully guarded vulnerability. "I didn't expect this," she said honestly. "When I accepted your proposal, I thought I was choosing safety over sentiment, power over passion. I thought I had learned my lesson about romantic delusions. And now," Arthur asked, echoing her earlier question. Rosalind stepped closer, close enough to see the firelight reflected in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Now I realize I was wrong, not about the value of power or the importance of practical considerations, but about the nature of what we were building together." She reached up at her free hand and touched his face, feeling him tense slightly at the intimacy of the gesture before relaxing into it. "I married the Duke of Ironwood, expecting a fortress. What I found was a partner who sees me, truly sees me, and protects me not because our contract demands it, but because he chooses to, because I matter to him." "You do," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You matter to me far more than I anticipated, far more than is probably wise." "Wisdom is overrated," Rosalind said, and rose on her toes to kiss him. This kiss was nothing like the restrained, formal meeting of lips at their wedding. This was fire and need, and two people who had armored themselves against the world finally allowing those walls to crack. Arthur's arms came around her, pulling her close with a possessiveness that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel safer than she ever had. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. "I cannot promise poetry or grand romantic gestures. I am not built for such things." "I don't want poetry," Rosalind said firmly. "I want honesty. I want partnership. I want someone who will stand beside me and fight my battles when I need him to, and trust me to. Fight my own when I can. I want what we have, Arthur, this strange, unexpected thing we built together. A marriage beyond the contract," Arthur said softly. "A marriage that was always going to become more than a contract," Rosalind corrected. "Because you cannot put two people who recognize each other's strength together and expect them to remain indifferent. We were never going to be merely business partners. Arthur, we were always going to be this." Arthur smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually severe face into something almost boyish. "Then I suppose I should confess that I began falling for you the moment you contradicted me at Lord Castlereagh's salon. I have been lying to myself about my motivations ever since." "We have both been lying to ourselves," Rosalind said. "Shall we agree to stop?" "Agreed," Arthur said, and kissed her again, sealing a different kind of contract. One written not in legal terms but in trust, in partnership, in the unexpected flowering of something that looked remarkably like love. Outside, London slept, unaware that the Duke and Duchess of Ironwood had just transformed their marriage from a strategic alliance into something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, fierce protection, and the kind of love that came not from pretty words, but from truly seeing and being seen. And so, Lady Rosalind Thorne, once the girl left humiliated at the Ashford ball, once mocked as the unwanted Thorne, became the most formidable duchess in all of England, not because she married a title, but because she found a man who saw her fire and chose to stand beside it rather than extinguish it. Julian Vane disappeared into obscurity, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms. Never cross the Duke of Ironwood, and never underestimate a woman who has learned to forge her pain into power. As for the Duke and Duchess of Ironwood, they ruled their estates with intelligence and precision, commanded London society with quiet authority, and built a love that was all the stronger for having been forged in honesty rather than illusion. Some said theirs was the greatest love story of the Regency era. Others argued it was the greatest revenge story. The truth, as Rosalind would tell you with that sharp smile of hers, was that it was both. After all, the best revenge is not just living well. It's loving fiercely, protecting ruthlessly, and never again allowing anyone to make you feel unwanted. If you love Rosalind and Arthur's story of revenge, transformation, and unexpected love, Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling Regency romance tales. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of powerful heroines, formidable heroes, and the sweet taste of justice served ice cold. Your support means everything. Subscribe now and join our community of romance readers who love their stories with spine, spirit, and satisfaction. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for tuning in and watching this video. You being here is the best encouragement I could ask for. The simplest and best way to show your support and tell me you want to see more content is to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That's your way of sending me love.